Thanks for tuning in to the 168 Podcast, a podcast from Mitchell Knight and Jordan Byrd of the Clarence Church of Christ, aimed at helping you connect Sunday worship with everyday life. What's up, 168ers? Welcome back to another edition of the 168 Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about giving to the church. This month at the Clarence Church of Christ, we're focused on missions, and Jordan last week preached a sermon on the importance of giving and how a faith promise is impactful for God's kingdom and his mission. So, maybe we could start with some of your thoughts on your sermon preparation, what you were thinking about with that topic and why you think it's important, just as like a general overview.
Yeah. So I think a little bit of context to why we wanted to discuss this is just thinking in general about giving in the church and the role that it plays within the body of people who are the church. And I think to address some of the maybe cultural assumptions that come into giving with any organization. And I think in our culture, in Western American culture, we typically think of like giving toward the church as being like, I contribute to the functioning of this body. And so it's a very practical thing, right? Just like a household, you have to have income coming in to pay for utilities and that kind of stuff. Same thing with like a church body. It's just bigger, right? Or we think of it like a company. The church maybe even gets compared to a political realm in some sense, where it's not a business, it's a nonprofit, but it has, still has income. It has to think about in terms of the needs of the body to function in terms of like a building or salaries or some of those things. But is that all there is to giving? Like, does it simply come down to X amount is needed to do X amount of things? And so it's just a very practical give and take. Or is there something broader or deeper in meaning when it comes to giving in the church? Do you want to touch on just that concept at all? Or flesh out maybe what I'm trying to say?
I think you're right. I think in our society, many of us look at giving to the church just kind of like giving to any other charity, just kind of giving them what they need to do what they do. But money is, I remember Pastor Jeff in Fredonia telling us that, money's instrumental. Like, it's not valuable in and of itself. It's just a way to either get something or get somewhere. And we're basically trying to equip people when it comes to like giving for missions to be able to carry out God's mission. It's not necessarily the giving of the money. It's more about the enabling of God's good work to be promoted. And I think when we look at it that way, we look at the end goal of what we're doing, it becomes less of a tax write-off at the end of the year, and just more of an actual life-changing event for someone in need. Like, we do stuff, even though it's not, giving money, but with like the IDES food pack, or like, you're giving meals to somebody else and supporting mission partners. They're able to not have to worry about more material things because they have support in that area. So I'm trying to walk a fine line here, but I hope what I'm saying makes sense. But it's more than just, just on our end of the mathematical stuff. It's like, I gave this amount. It could mean that, well, you actually gave like 6 meals to people in need in another country through one of our mission partners. I mean, I think that's kind of the impetus for giving, at least for me. There's more of a life impacting consequence to your giving that's more aligned with what God wants to do in the world rather than just doing good for good's sake.
Yeah, I mean, bottom line is the giving, general giving to the church in most churches does go to at least to some portion of it, at least, if not maybe a good chunk of it for a lot of churches, goes to local functioning of that body, whether that's, salaries of staff or to upkeep a building, things like that. Like, I'm not trying to say that that's not there. I'm just trying to say, I think our typical thinking of giving or contributing, or even the mentality of like thinking about paying toward an organization. Like I pay X amount toward this streaming service or this, like my cable bill or whatever, and by doing so, like I get this thing back in return. And so my point, kind of like at least starting here, is just pointing out that we can often, or we're shaped in our culture to think about services in that way. Like I give or contribute or whatever this amount of money, because we're all talking about money here essentially, and what comes back from that. And so the perspective could either be, it's like, what do I get out of it? Or, the outer band of that would be like beyond just me, to like, who else is being impacted by this? And so that's kind of, I think, getting to what you're talking about. And I think our discussion wants to touch on, like, there's probably even more to it than just that. Because like what you're touching on is, yeah, you're giving towards something that's bigger than just you benefiting. It's, other people who are benefiting from it, that kind of thing.
That's a good way to sum it up. Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at. Just, you're not, because you're right. It's more of like the materialistic part of us saying, if I'm spending money, I'm usually getting something for what I'm spending. And in maybe a deeper spiritual sense, like we'll talk about in a little bit, that is true with this. But it's more about, a sacrifice to yourself, like what you were saying, in order to bless other people, not necessarily to expect something in return, but to expect, God to do his work in the world through your donation.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the parallel here, and I think I already alluded to it, is in politics, right? I mean, it's not uncommon to hear someone talk about, well, I pay toward the tax, I give toward taxes. I mean, my taxes go toward this service. Why aren't we getting the return out of it? Or it should be better. I'm contributing toward it. I should have a say in it, that kind of a thing. And I'm not saying that all people do this with the church, but that's a way that we are shaped to view our money going towards something that's a broader organization. And so I think some of that mindset can creep into the perspective of how a church functions too, of, well, I gave my money, so therefore, like, it's like this dictatorial thing, like we can hold it as leverage or whatever. And I'm not saying like that viewpoint or mindset is like completely absent there. Like, obviously be discerning about where you're putting your money. Like if you think a church or any other organization is like just like wasting it, then use discernment there. Like I'm not saying you can't have that, but I'm just saying that mentality can be shaped in how we view money, especially I think in the church to some degree. And I think some people, will say, hey, I'm going to take my money elsewhere, or people, I've even heard it mentioned like, well, if you don't make this thing in the church how I would want it, like, I give whatever amount, and if I go, that's going to, hurt the bottom line of the church or something like that. And all of that is a mindset or the impetus for how someone's giving. Like that's what's dictating what they do, not just the broader things that are happening through the church, like what you're talking about. And
yeah.
I think one thing we need to probably like side note here is that, at least from my understanding, or at least my history within the churches that, the church I grew up in and the one I'm, we're part of now with Clarence Church of Christ, is that different churches approach giving, especially toward missions, in different ways, at least from my understanding. Like what we do in our congregation with a faith promise is different than what I know the church I grew up in did. Their approach was everything that was given toward the body of Christ, through an offering as a whole, they designated that like 10%, no matter what of that, was going to go toward missions. And that's how they approached it. So in a sense, like when you gave your regular offering to the church, it was understood, or at least talked about, that like, you're giving toward missions in doing this. So like it's still like you have the choice to give, right? And I'm not sure if they did any kind of like designated giving or anything like that, but I just know like that's how they approached it. Whereas like with the way we have it set up is there's like general giving toward like the more local functioning of the church, if you will, like the building, salaries, the ministries the church does within a local community. And then the mission partners that we support around the world, that budget of what is given is tabulated separately. And that's what is done through faith promises. So a faith promise is simply just a amount that a person has discerned in prayerful relationship with God, of like what they believe God would have them give up in their means, or they're prayerfully approaching like, hey God, can I give this amount, or would you enable me to be able to give this amount? And they pledge or promise, if you will, that they're going to give that amount per month for the next year. And out of that promise, and as everyone else does, that total amount of money is then figured out to split up among the mission partners that the church supports. And so that's a separate giving than like general giving, but the mentality of giving in general is still similar to how another church would approach it. It's just not all lumped together, is kind of what I'm trying to say. But just to kind of point out that different churches approach it a little bit differently. But the faith promise model is how our congregation specifically approaches it. You want to touch on any of that at all?
Yeah, I maybe just to kind of put a bow on it, like with this part of it. I mean, we've kind of gone over that giving toward God's kingdom is not purchasing a service for yourself. It's about like actually investing in God's kingdom. And when you look at it from that mentality, if you know you're doing it as a blessing, like you mentioned in your sermon, or kind of a little bit just now, you alluded to it, that, in talking about sometimes you have to pray that, hey, can you enable me to give this amount? Like sometimes giving for the kingdom means it's a sacrifice. It's not always going to flow from abundant reserves. I mean, you think about like Jesus talking about the poor woman who put in everything that she owned, and she ended up giving much more than people who, were wealthier, more well off. So yeah, I mean, the act of giving, if we look at it already as a sacrifice, then, I feel like that kind of gets us more rooted in that mentality that it's not purchasing things for myself. It's about giving of myself for the benefit of the kingdom.
Yeah.
So, and yeah, I mean, the faith promise stuff is, yeah, I mean, it's a great way to do that. I mean, especially we kind of get into that mentality because it's a separate thing that we say, well, this is about like over and above what you're doing, like your regular donation. I think it even says that on the form. I mean, it's like different than your regular donation. If you can promise to give this much, like, you'll see fruit be born for God's kingdom. And yeah, I think that the separation of it for me helps me get into that more sacrificial mentality for sure.
Yeah, and by no means am I trying to say that either way of approaching giving toward, missionary work around the world is not entailing this sacrificial approach to it. Like, I think both entail having to have that mentality or mindset going into it. I think if I'm not wrong in stating this, the kind of taking the 10% off is very much based on like a tithe mentality. So like you see a lot of that more in the Old Testament. And I mean, it's still a designated amount. Like it's not like a bad approach. I think from my viewpoint, like the one benefit of maybe a faith promise is that, and I think you already kind of made this point, there's maybe a little bit more intentionality that's put specifically toward that. But it also kind of makes it a little bit more, maybe more obscure because you're talking about two different ways of giving in that way. But at least from faith promises specifically, I know the message I most recently gave, I tried to tie how we see a faith promise being made by the Philippian church to the work that the Apostle Paul did in various places beyond the town or city of Philippi and Macedonia. And even there, at least if you look kind of in what's mentioned about the Philippian church in Corinthians, it gives the impression that they, at least in the one instance for sure, when they're giving toward the church in Jerusalem, where like the churches are collecting an offering, and Paul eventually takes it to Jerusalem, or part of a convoy that takes it there. But at least in that passage in Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 8, I think, is 8 and 9, somewhere in there. It talks about how they gave kind of over and beyond. So there is a little bit of mentioning above or beyond like what their initial like level of giving could have been. And whether that played out like how we do it today, where there's like sort of normal giving to like the local body of Christ and the ministry it does, or if it's in terms of like a separate thing to like missionary work or to help someone in a city nowhere near you, I think it's kind of beside the point, but the heart of how they approach that is what I was looking to tap into in terms of bringing it out of what we see in scripture. And yeah, I mean, I think what you see there is that there was a belief in who God was that backed their approach to giving. And it is very much that they are incapable of giving the amount that they gave if it weren't for God being active in their life. And I think that plays out in multiple different ways. Like, on one hand, it alludes to that they were able to give more money than they initially thought that they could. So there's one thing that comes out of it. But then you see some of the references that Paul makes to their approach to giving, that it also looks like they benefit in a, like they matured spiritually in the process. So not only was there like more money that came out of the process of them giving, but also their character was developed in the process. So there was two things that increased, at least from that standpoint alone, let alone talking about how it benefited Paul and what he did. And he's not, that's not the Philippians benefiting in any way. That's Paul benefiting. And I don't think it's a stretch to say like Paul's character probably was built in that way as well. So it kind of dominoes maybe in that way. I didn't really mention that in my message, but that's kind of clicking just thinking about it now.
Yeah, so I was going to touch on that, what you just brought up. So we've kind of laid the foundation for what biblical or godly giving to the church looks like. But I think a lot of times, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this today, a lot of times we hear about why it's impactful for God's kingdom from the more church-oriented, like the more corporate church-oriented perspective, but we don't really come at it from, what Paul is saying about how it develops our character to be more Christ-like. Because our giving, our sacrificial giving is helping us to be more like Christ. I mean, you even hear that in the word sacrifice. If your gift is a sacrifice, you're showing that you and your personal affairs are less important than what you want to see God do. And I just think it helps us to, because I think we're really, especially in America, I think we're obsessed with ownership. Like, we have everything, we own everything. Like we were talking about before, if we spend money, we get something for it. But in reality, I mean, everything we have is ultimately borrowed. I mean, this house, my food, all my possessions are under my name, but my name is under Jesus's. So, I mean, I think giving in that way helps you to get into a more humble mindset. So I think, the sacrificial part of it, the humble part of it, if that can be attributed to you through giving as a practice, then that helps develop you into being more Christ-like. And yeah, I just think that's really cool about it. So I mean, you're building yourself up. And we talked about not purchasing anything for yourself, but when you're in the right mindset of giving of yourself to do it, you are becoming more like Christ.
Yeah, and I think one of the main things that stands out in terms of giving in the formation that happens to, or the shaping of us into being more Christ-like that comes out of it is, I think the thing for us, especially in our culture, that really comes out, and you just hit on it, and that like we really gravitate toward ownership. And I think one thing that giving shapes us to be is dependent on someone else, in this instance God, and also to recognize that like ultimately it all comes from him. So there's a having to give up control ultimately in the process, right? Because I mean, you could approach it that way, but I don't know if the same benefits, probably formational benefits, probably going to come if you approach giving from the standpoint of, well, I'm giving, but I don't see this certain thing playing out, so therefore I don't want to give, because your mentality there is like, I want to control it.
Yeah.
And again, that's not to say like there can't be discernment and if they're doing nefarious things, like I get it. Like, you don't want to support evil things if that's what's happening. But in general, like, I think we default to maybe wanting to be more micromanagers than maybe we tend to think that we probably are. I mean, that's just the culture where we swim in all the time of, I get to shape and mold and do the things that I do. Like, that's our culture. It's very individualized. And like, I get to dictate like what I do. And so therefore it extends into how our money gets used. I mean, and this it doesn't take long to see how this plays out just in commerce, right? Like our culture is very much shifted to like customer is always right, regardless of the fact. I mean, who has not returned something to Walmart that you're like, how did they even take that back? I mean, it's just like their motto has defaulted to like, no, you're gonna get you're in the right here, and no questions asked to some degree. Anyway, I mean, I think that's one thing that definitely comes out is giving up control of a part of our life, even if it's in a financial way. But that's part of surrendering, right? And that's part of what our call to follow Jesus is about, is surrendering our control to his leading, providing, his wisdom, his will, all those different things. It's like you're in control even if I don't really know how in the world this plays out. Even if I don't see like 10 people come to follow Jesus in the process, like you're using it somehow. And that was kind of my point in sort of highlighting all the things that comes out in the exchange between the church in Philippi and the Apostle Paul, is that whether Paul was benefited or whether people came to Christ in the process or whether the Philippians themselves became more mature, like there was a benefit or fruit to be bore regardless. And that seems to be what is for sure or certain in the process of giving toward God's mission. And that's like one of the things that's what we're trying to highlight in talking about this, is that it's not just I gave this much money and so this practical return came back. And it's not to say there's not tangible returns or like real visible or discernible returns, because it could be in your character and that's still a return. But usually that's not something we can make happen on our own. Like that's the inside out thing that God does that we can't do. I don't know, you want to touch on anything else there?
Yeah, the last thing I'd add is just from my own personal background, like coming at a lot of the aspects of the faith from a skeptic's position. I mean, most of us, at least, in my class, in regular high school history, I mean, you learn a little bit about church history and you learn about things like, the Catholic Church, when they were doing indulgences where you could pay money to supposedly get your loved ones out of purgatory faster and that kind of stuff. And like when you see that kind of stuff, at least for me, it's like, well, this is a scam. Like, why would you give anything? Like, so I came in it from the perspective that people were giving to the church across the board just because they were expecting something in return. But in coming to know Christ better and seeing how his people actually gave, it's like, wait, you're just kind of giving this, you're not expecting anything back from it. You're recognizing it's not yours. You're not thinking like you're going to get to heaven if you do this. And in doing that and seeing their example, that actually was, it's like, wow, that person is different. Like, I haven't seen that before. That person's, there's something you can't put on that kind of example. And of course now, there is something you could put on that example. That's Christ-like behavior. It's like, this isn't me. This isn't my stuff. Your will be done. It's like, I know I'm giving this up, and if I don't get anything back from it, it's whatever. So, I mean, for me, that was, it was more implicit in my mind until we talked about it now. But, I mean, yeah, especially being out at Pillar of Fire in Fredonia and seeing people give of themselves, and then being at Clarence and seeing, especially like the mission donations and stuff like that, that kind of helped me to get more rooted in that mindset. So,
All right.
Now, it's time for the 168 debate.
So today we're doing a very simple 168 debate with some very ripe, luscious, low-hanging fruit, and predicting the Super Bowl between the Cincinnati Bengals, I still can't believe that, and the Los Angeles Rams, which should still be St. Louis, but whatever. LA, look, California has enough. Leave them alone. St. Louis, what does Missouri have?
I bet there's some prop bet about how many times St. Louis will be mentioned. Only just because Kurt Warner, the last time, well, I guess it wasn't the last time they're in the Super Bowl, but just the history and some of that stuff. Like, I bet that's got to be a prop bet somewhere of how often it's mentioned or whatever.
So how about we'll do it 2 questions for each of us. So from the more emotional side of it, who would you want to get the Lombardi Trophy. I can't believe I forgot the name of the trophy. Who would you want to get the Lombardi Trophy from a more emotional perspective? Like leaving out any analysis and who you think would win, who would you want to win? You first.
The Rams, but purely from a Matthew Stafford standpoint. Just the guy endured in Detroit for as long as he did. He's not horrible, and it's just he never had anything to be able to get him there, it seems like. And so really from him alone is really like I feel like he's put a lot of like long, arduous years into the sport, and like it'd be cool to see him be able to like see the mountaintop of a payoff. And not that he hasn't had that in other ways in his life, but I think it'd be cool because like at least from my understanding, like I don't think he forced his way out of Detroit. Like it was a trade that just the teams decided. So there's not that whole like, oh, you just wanted to get out mentality. Like he's just along for the ride, and like he ended up in a situation where he's thrived. Not that he wasn't before as a player, but the team has done well. So for him alone really is the thing I want to see.
Yeah, for me, I think it's tough with this matchup because either way, it's kind of a heartbreak story with who loses. But like, Cincinnati fans have obviously paid their dues for like a Super Bowl win. But what's really strange is that the Bengals are still kind of in like a rebuilding phase, and they're already there. They've got a really young, healthy, talented team. So like even if they lose, I think they'll be back at some point. And for that reason, and especially with the management at the Rams, I mean, they went all in for like now. Like we want to do this now. We got Matthew Stafford now. Like our next first round pick is whatever, like 6 years from now. All like so many of our contracts are like going to be up after this year. Like if they don't win, that's going to really sting. And like Jordan said, it's close, but I would want the Rams to win just because of that that Matthew Stafford storyline, especially because Cooper Kupp as a wide receiver is in the same statistical league as Calvin Johnson with the catches, the receiving yards, and the touchdowns, and Matthew Stafford is the glue between both of them. So it's just there's all kinds of cool stuff. I mean, the fact that Matthew Stafford was a quarterback I rarely thought about until this year, just because he was like lambasted in Detroit, and it'd be really cool to see him win.
The other emotional things for me are just really the Bengals win before Buffalo, and then the other thing is just like they were 4 and whatever last year, and in the Super Bowl this year, and then you have like Buffalo's history of like forever just like in the middle there, and it's just like no, it doesn't work. No, shouldn't go from like 4 wins to you win the Super Bowl in a year. But I'm sure other teams have probably done similar.
Last 2 emotional things. First, now that the Bengals have upset the Kansas City Chiefs, either way it would have been fine, but now it's definitely fine. The 4 AFC Championship wins in a row by Buffalo is still safe. And the second thing is the Bengals beat the Chiefs with the same 13 seconds that all the Chiefs fans have been rubbing in Bills Mafia's face. So that is awesome. Now, onto the objective analysis on who you think is going to win, just based on how the teams play, the rosters. I could start. Thankfully for me, that the emotional pick and the objective pick, I think, is the same for me. Just with the Rams, I would pick the Rams to win. And again, like if we're gonna go with like a point differential, I think it's gonna be close. I mean, like I'd probably be like a field goal, like 3 points. But I would have the Rams favored by like 3 points. I don't condone betting, by the way, but that's just the way they predict games. I would just say with how bad Cincinnati's offensive line is, which it's bad. I mean, in the divisional round, you got sacked 13 times and still won. I mean, that's fine, but what if it's not fine? Like, what if he drops the ball one of those times? What if he's pressured into a throw? And with the superstar defense that the Rams have, I mean, I would be surprised if they didn't just decimate them up front. So whatever, like Cincinnati would have to like be really quick about getting the ball away. Like T. Higgins would have to have like an amazing game, which he did in the championship game. So, I mean, you never know. That's why I think it's close. I mean, giving the Rams home field advantage, basically, which is weird because they're at home.
I still can't believe, like, Mitch and I were talking about this before we recorded, but when else in our lifetime will there be likely 2 Super Bowls played back-to-back in a team's home field? Like, I don't know that probably what. I mean, it was miraculous, whatever. I mean, it was like the first was last year that even ever happened, let alone it's happening 2 times in a row, which is just crazy still. But yeah, so from an objective standpoint, I still think the Rams have the edge. I don't know that I quite have the analysis you have, other than I think there's probably some just general more experience for whatever that's worth in a playoff sense. I think the moment could overwhelm Cincinnati, possibly. I mean, it's hard to tell, but I do think the defense of the Rams should fare well. The one thing with the Rams, it seems like sometimes it's hard to know which team will show up. It seems, I don't know, or you have the random pick, maybe not random, but pick that Stafford throws and like what that. I mean, it almost happened in the last game with them. So
there's that inconsistency there for sure. But yeah, like you're saying. But what's different about the Rams, though, as opposed to the other, like, quote-unquote, two-faced teams this season, is, like, they can have, like, a low. Like, they can have a horrible first half and then immediately bounce back and, like, randomly in the fourth quarter and just play really well.
Yeah.
So it's possible. So, like, there's pressure on both sides. Like, Stafford could, like, throw an Instacart delivery to the secondary of the Bengals. Like, that's possible. But, like you're saying, Burrow could get overwhelmed, too.
And did we figure out that they really have never played each other?
No, I haven't figured that out.
I had heard this, but maybe need some more research to actually confirm.
Definitely not in the Super Bowl. I don't think they played in the Super Bowl.
Maybe playoffs is what I was hearing, but either way, yeah. So overall, I think the Rams definitely have the edge. It could come down to game management of the coaches, and McVay has made some iffy game management decisions, it seems like. So who knows if that'll cost them. I more hope it's not the game a couple years ago against the Patriots where it was like whatever, what was it, 17-6 or some.
No,
was even
it was
10-6,
15,
whatever it was.
15-3. The only touchdown was scored by the Patriots by Julian Edelman on like one of the first drives, and he was the MVP. When the receiver is the MVP, it's.
So anyway, I just hope it's not that kind of game. I just hope it's a game in general. But so yeah, that's. I still think Rams, and that's who I want overall to win.
Okay, let us know your predictions down in the comments.
If you disagree,
168ers. All right, you want to start the wrap up?
Sure. So thank you for joining us for the 168 podcast, and we hope that our conversation has at least stirred your thoughts to think further and deeper about how you approach giving through the church and participating in God's mission by giving toward it. And hopefully it has helped stir thoughts about how God is shaping and molding you to become more like him and through that process. And we hope you enjoyed our other discussion, although it's not as meaningful, but it's still fun to have. And yeah, like Mitch said, let us know if you agree or disagree. And yeah, we'll catch you next time. Thanks for joining.
See you later, 168ers.